All right, folks, welcome back to the How to Retire on $3,000 per week podcast. Ben and I are here chatting about really part two first, Ben, because we've pivoted from the foundations to now the property investment formula.
Well, Bryce, we debated about how we would set up the start of this chapter. So for those, who are trying to, if you're ever thinking about writing a book, you've got to have it flow correctly. So obviously the property investment formula needed to go next off the back of the power of compound in terms of chapter 5. But asset selection, there really wasn't, we had a choice to put, cash flow management and potentially borrowing power next. But we chose asset selection because it just flows more sensibly off the back of the diagrams and showing the compounding returns that we're seeing. Like everything we were referring to was residential property and some of the charts with totality and all of that. So asset selection just needed to be here. And that's the backstory in terms of why it made chapter 6.
Now, Ben, I've got to be honest to the listeners. This was a monster chapter.
Yes, it's big.
Every other one I read, I just did each chapter in one hit. Not this one.
Yeah, that's right.
But it's important. Like assets, like the whole game is making sure you buy the right asset.
It is, and everyone's got their thesis in terms of how to do that. And we've got a lot of fresh content in here in terms of what we hadn't explored in the other book and obviously in the podcast. I mean, obviously, we've always been telling people about, investment grade and, owner-occupier appeal and that scarcity. I mean, they are, they're our bread and butter foundations, and that obviously led at the very early parts of our podcast to talk about location does 80% of the heavy lifting, which you'll find in here. But we expanded out on those in terms of prime lens and also potentially the entry-level ends of the market that we were looking at.
Yeah, we haven't tackled that anywhere else. Not on a podcast.
No,
not on a blog. Not on a video. We hadn't talked about it on when we were a guest on any other podcast. That was totally fresh and new. For this book, and that was an evolution because if you go back to when there's a bit of confusion at times when some of our listeners go, "Oh, you said in the first 100 episodes." Yes. That particular part of the book is an evolution of what we observed over the last decade.
Well, it's also about that's what happens when property prices double.
Yeah.
And, we still needed to make sure that we were going to write a book for anyone who was a budding investor that they could still get into the market and play. I mean, we still think that, one or two good properties, obviously, if you can afford great properties, that's fine. But if you also can get into the market, we still think that that's a better outcome than trying to save your way to retirement. So that's where the entry-level lens came in, the location lens. And, that's why we talked about those key characteristics. And obviously, most people who have done a couple of laps with us would know what we mean when we talk about prime location lenses and the key characteristics and approach that we're looking for there with that scarcity and that status and that human emotion appeal. But we also know that entry-level locations can get a ripple effect and a lift up because just purely on the back of supply, demand and affordability.
We're recording this about 26 years after I bought my first investment, my first property. And there's something in this chapter that I wish I knew back 26 years ago that I did not know, and that was margin of safety. Ben.
Yes.
Because we started this chapter with me talking about my first investment property that was in an 110-unit complex. I did not know back then what margin of safety meant didn't know in period, but not even in the context, because what we explained in this chapter is when the developer turns a piece of land into 110 apartments, there is no margin of safety left. It has been extinguished. The developer got the benefit of all of the margin of safety that was left and like a sponge just wrung it out. And here I was. And I've gone back from time to time and checked the performance of that first property. And, 26 years ago, Ben, if you put that on the back of the compounding chapter we just came from about the third decade, this property would not have achieved anything that would... 2.77% compounding, Ben, the last time I checked. That's not very impressive. But as I said in that chapter, and this is what I want to say to anyone who's listening to this, it was the best property I ever purchased because...
I've heard you say this a few times.
Oh, got me in the game.
Yeah, got you in the game.
And from then on, every property after that was actually easier than that one.
Yeah, so why have we dedicated a good portion of the book? Because at the end of the day, not all properties are created equal. It's pure and simple, and so margin of safety comes in different forms as well. Like if you think about, we've always talked about land scarcity, in terms of that, but the margin of safety also can play itself into economic activity. Like, if you go and buy in a booming town, and then that town, the economic drivers or whatever that got that town booming are no longer there, then there's a margin of safety in terms of the future economic activity of that area. Because if the population are leaving, well, what do you need? Why do you need, shelter? If no one's there to take it up because there's no jobs there. So that's why we also spent a fair bit of time in teaching people about the power of economic activity and economic growth of a city and the power of the bigger cities, because in reality, that's the insurance policy, and that reduces your margin, or that increases your margin of safety, but reduces your margin of error.
Didn't we cover some fundamentals from the first 100 episodes here? We talked
could
about
have 300 pages on this.
The 3 price drivers of economic activity, human behaviour, the macro to micro framework, the 3 sort of concurrent circles that define an investment grade property. We have done a lot in this particular chapter, but the buyer's decision quadrant, I used that every single day when I was on the set of location, Ben. Every single time I was talking to those clients on that television show was essentially, which one of these 4 quadrants are you going to compromise on?
Which one are you going to drop off? and then framing it up for people who are starting out around, start with the macro and then drive down into the micro. So look at the national, look at the state economics, look at the city or the region that you're looking at, and then you can drill down into the suburb area. And then off the back of that, the street, and then obviously into the property itself. So it's heavy going. It's
it's comprehensive. It's intended to be a reference.
Yeah, agreed. You
that
can
you go
always
back
come
to.
back to that. Yep.
Yeah. So, folks, ironically, starting with asset selection is Ben set this conversation we're having beautifully by saying it's the perfect flow on from compounding.
Yeah.
But it's actually the number one thing we see people get wrong is when they start with the property first.
Yes.
It's later on in the book we're going to talk about property investing being
you
a
didn't
process.
know any better at the time when you bought that first investment
but the thing
property
is,
23
most people
years ago.
don't.
Of course, I bought the house across the road from Mum and Dad in Fundura.
Yeah, that was.
What was I thinking?
Just because you're a tight ass, because you wanted to use the lawnmower.
yeah, exactly. Mum could do my washing. Yeah, so there's all of that, but there's also another important part there that I want them to have some slow thinking about new versus old. I think we've worked really hard over the last decade of educating people on the podcast as well, to try and get them to understand that the math's just impossible to beat the old, because it's all in the land value and land to asset ratio. Once that lands for you, you'll be in the winner's seat. You'll be in the winner's seat.
So there you go, folks. We've just covered Chapter 6, Asset Selection. If you are playing along at home, we'd love you to do that with your copy of How to Retire on $3,000 per week, the Property Couch's playbook for passive property investing. If you have stumbled across this podcast and you don't have a copy, you can go to How to Retire on 3k.com.au, and in there, audiobooks, where you can get your hands on it. We'd certainly love you to do that. But we hope you're enjoying this, because the next chapter we're about to go on is arguably where the main game is spent for property investing, because property is a game of finance.
The unfair advantage, maybe.
So there you go. All right, look forward to doing that. We hope you continue to stick around with us, folks.